So President Trump told us he would end the war on Ukraine on day one. We're now 128 days into his presidency, and he's had an Oval Office blow-up, with Ukrainian President Zelensky that we won't forget, including a social media showdown with Russian President Vladimir Putin. And now it appears that a ceasefire deal could be further away than ever. Well, Keith Kellogg, President Trump's special envoy to Ukraine, criticized the Russians on X this week, writing, "President Donald Trump is working to stop this war and end the killing. We await receipt of the Russian memorandum that you promised a week ago. Ceasefire now." So can General Kellogg bring everyone to the table? Let's ask him. He joins me live in studio right now. General, good to see you again.
Kara, it's good to be with you. Thank
you. Let's start with this memo. The Ukrainians, and this just came across, are saying they may not show up to another round of talks that were set for Monday until they see that memorandum. So I guess my question is, what's in the memorandum, and why won't Russia hand it over so we can see what the conditions are?
Yeah, Kira, they need to. And what the memorandum is it's the term I use, it's a term sheet. And we've got the Ukrainian term sheet. And that was a result of us coming out of Paris and then London. We came that, and we showed it to the president. There's 22 different terms on there that we think are pretty good, and they're all reasonable. And we thought they were pretty good because neither side really liked them a lot. If neither side likes it, you're probably on the right track. And when President Trump talked to President Putin said, "Well, within a week, I'm going to give you we call it a memorandum."
Okay.
And we haven't seen it yet. The Ukrainians have not seen it. As of when we came over here this afternoon, I asked the chief of staff to the Ukrainians if he had gotten Andrei Yermak, and he said he hasn't seen it at all. And I also talked to their lead negotiator, Rustem Umerov, who will be the lead negotiator on the next talks in Istanbul, and he hadn't seen it as well. And I always caution him, don't say things like that, because if you don't show up, part of life is showing up. And you need to show you're serious. And the thing you were driving to is to get a ceasefire, because that stops the killing. If we get to the ceasefire, and the term I use is comprehensive. Comprehensive defined as air, land, sea infrastructure. Just stop it. As when I talked to Umerov recently, and he said, "General Kellogg, you always ask me that question, and my answers have always been very simple to you. A ceasefire means stop the shooting, okay? Stop the shooting. I get it, okay? Now I understand." And that's what we want to get to. So we need to take what we get from the Russians. We need to get to what the Ukrainians have. We're going to try to merge them together and say, okay, these are points that are negotiable and these are points that are non-negotiable. Let's see where we get to, and we have discussions next week when we're in Istanbul.
So just some of the notes that I took, there is this report that Putin has outlined these conditions for ending the war, including demanding Western leaders pledge in writing that NATO won't expand eastward. Is President Trump willing to make that kind of commitment to Putin that NATO won't expand?
Well, I think it's a fair concern, and we've said that repeatedly. Like we've said that to us, Ukraine coming into NATO is not on the table. And we're not the only country that says that. I can probably give you 4 of the countries in NATO, and it takes 32 of the 32 to allow you to come into NATO. And we've seen other countries saying, "No, we're not too sure about that." And that's one of the issues that Russia will bring up. And they're only us just talking Ukraine. They're talking the country of Georgia. They're talking Moldova. They're talking, obviously, Ukraine. And we're saying, okay, comprehensively, we can stop the expansion of NATO coming close to your border. That's security concerns for them. But that's a presidential decision. It's not my decision to make. And these are the things we go to the president and say, Mr. President, this is what we talked about. This is what everybody's willing to do. Are you willing to accept that? Are you willing to go with it? And then, hopefully, then we'll have a negotiation, a discussion between President Trump, President Putin, and President Zelensky, and get an end state to this and stop the killing. The killing, honestly, Kira, the numbers are absolutely horrific. I mean, when President Trump says, 5,000 a week, he's right.
Well, and President just said this week that Putin is playing with fire by refusing to engage in these ceasefire talks. And even as he's saying this, Russian forces are making small gains on the battlefield. So in Trump world, what happens when Putin plays with fire?
Well, I think it's a huge mistake to do that with Donald J. Trump. I think one of the things you should never underestimate Donald J. Trump. The second is never put him in a position that he thinks he's being used. And I think his frustration is that he's put forward some reasonable proposals and reasonable discussions, and he's seen a level of unreasonableness that really frustrates me. It frustrates me as well. I said, come on, we're not talking, we're not talking about you demanding us to sell you back Alaska. We're just saying these are certain things we need to get to. They're reasonable discussions, be it membership in NATO or what the territory looks like on the ground with the they call them oblast states, which is Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, and Crimea. And those are all areas that have got Russian troops in them. They don't have them fully occupied. The only oblast that they have really is Luhansk to the far north. But they're fighting hard in Donetsk, they're fighting hard in Zaporizhia and Kherson as well. And of course they've got Crimea that they picked up in 2014. And these are the things that when we get into Istanbul next week, we'll sit down and talk. What does it look like? What are your feelings on it? And we'll have what we call the E3 with us. That is the national security advisors from Germany, France, and Great Britain. And they're kind of, when we were in London, they kind of helped us mold the term sheet for Ukraine. And they'll be there as well. And we'll get their feedback as well.
And you talk about the areas of land, but then you look at some of the demands that Russia is making, and they're pretty extreme. I mean, disarming its military, demanding that Ukraine disarm its military, give up major cities, giving how extreme these demands are. I mean, do you think Putin really wants peace when he starts throwing out those types of demands?
I think it's in his best interest, Kira, that he goes to peace. I mean, look, we know that his casualty levels are quite high with his soldiers, and we're talking numbers. The Soviet Union left Afghanistan after losing 18,000. We left Vietnam after losing a little over 60,000. Their numbers on both sides, when you add them together, both wounded and dead, are conservatively about 1.2 million. That is a stunning number. I mean, this is war at an industrial strength level. And then what they're doing with their ballistic missiles, with the Iskanders, firing them into cities like Kyiv, or using their drones, shooting them into Kyiv. When they did that the other day, that's a direct violation of what's called the Geneva Protocols that were passed in 1977 that we signed up to, the Russians signed up to, the Ukrainians signed up to, that you would not use weapons of mass destruction against civilian infrastructure and civilians. So
that leads me to my next question, and that is, your colleague, even Steve Witkoff, the quote that I wrote down, he said, I just don't see that Putin wants to take all of Europe. I take him at his word in this sense, and I believe the Europeans are beginning to come to that belief too. But then I hear what terms have been agreed to in the past, and, can you trust President Putin?
Well, I think when you look at the Europeans, I think I would advise Steve, you better talk to the Chancellor of Germany, Merz. When you got the President of France with Macron, you've got the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Starmer. They see the world a little bit differently. They live in that neighborhood, and it's a tough neighborhood to live in. And they think they're at risk. I was just with the Finnish ambassador yesterday. I went to the residence, we had lunch. And the Russians are actually building up forces on their border. Now, they've got the longest border, Finland does, with Russia. And they obviously have concerns as well, and they should.
So now Finland is feeling threatened.
Yeah, they do, and they've got a really great president, Alex Stubb, and he's talked to the president as well. And I mean, you throw out those, like, be very, very cautious about when you say things about expansion, because to me, the reason I believe the United States needs to stay involved is because of escalation. Because when the assassin of Archduke Ferdinand killed him, he never thought in the back of his mind, well, I'm going to start World War I. Well, it did. And that level of escalation, you go up an escalation ladder. You don't know. You better know when you need to get off it, because if you don't get off it, then you've got a big problem.
We talk about Trump saying that Putin's playing with fire. How many pictures have we seen of Putin and Trump shaking hands? And of course, that always makes headlines. And then the next thing you know, he's saying, yeah, you're playing with fire. What is the deal between these two? What is the essence of this relationship?
Well, I think the essence is there's a personal relationship there, which is very powerful, because I think what President Trump has done as president, he's he's done something that we haven't seen in a president in a long time, which is get personally engaged. I mean, putting his own reputation on the line, his own leadership on the line, and you see that. You know, I've told the president before, I said, you know, you're a lot like Winston Churchill. And I said, what I mean by that is Winston Churchill in World War II, he used words as weapons, and President Trump does as well, and he's very good at it. And I think
Churchill even wrote him on his war maps. If you go down into his war rooms in London, you'll see what he said about Hitler, plain and simple, which I'm sure the president says behind closed doors as well. But I'm sorry, continue.
But he's really good at it. And I think, you know, you're looking at, to me, the ultimate deal maker of the world is President Donald J. Trump. And he's trying to get his position and use this personal relationship and use his instincts. And to me, President Trump's instincts are off the chart. If you read his book, and I would remind anybody who works with Donald J. Trump, you better read his books, like Art of the Deal. Because to me, when you look at Donald J. Trump, he's very transparent. I mean,
well, then let me ask, okay, then this is a good segue. Trump has threatened to walk away entirely from negotiations. And we know how he can get angry and all of a sudden he'll cut you off.
Right.
At what point does that really happen here?
I think when you talk about walking away, if he believes he's being used and that there's no hope and progress going forward, he basically says, we're done with this. Europe, you own it. Over to you. And but my concern on that, and that's what I come back to.
Yeah, what happens to Ukraine?
Well, not only just Ukraine, it's what happens globally, because this is a different situation than President Trump had in his first term. Because then we had the Russians independent, China independent, we had Iran independent, we had the North Koreans independent. Now they're all together, and they've got treaties together, either partnership treaties or actually defense treaties like with North Korea. And because of that, your level of risk can go up if you don't watch out, and things can happen bad. And then you're in response mode. And what I mean by that, because hypothetically this can actually happen, where the North Koreans provided fighting troops to Russia to fight against the Ukrainians. They've met them on the battlefield near Kursk. Well, the reverse is true. Under that treaty that they signed, that if South Korea and North Korea get into a fight, Russia's obligated by treaty to provide troops. So you could see Russian troops on the battlefield in the Korean Peninsula. And do you really want to go there? And I don't think anybody does. You know, so this is one of those, okay, where does this begin? That's what I was talking about, the escalation ladder, is how do you get off this ladder if it goes up there? And that's when you want people to be reasonable. And you want to make sure they've thought through it. They know what the outcome potentially is, good or bad. And you rely on your advisors to be very, very good and kind of explain to you as the president. And the advisors are advisors. They didn't get a single electoral college vote, not one. The president is, constitutionally, he's the man who makes those decisions as commander-in-chief. So you want to make sure you advise him. You say, okay, Mr. President, here's what it looks like. Here's the risk levels we're at. Here's what it looks like we're going to go to. This is my recommendation to you. And in my experience with President Trump in the last administration was he really listens really well, but he's also very Socratic in how he does decision-making. What I mean by that, going back to my college days, is Socratically, I'm talking about when you're in the room with him, he will ask you what your thought is, and you better be ready to answer. And I remember one of the very first, not the old, it was actually in the Situation Room, when we were talking about Afghanistan. He went around the entire room, and he said, what do you think? What do you think? And he got to a young woman who was sitting to my left, and she said, hey, Mr. President, I'm just a note taker. He goes, oh, no. If you're in the Situation Room, I want to know what you're thinking. And so he kind of said, okay, poke, see what it is. And you better be able to deliver. And that's what I love about him. He's what I mean by the Socratic nature. He'll reach out to people. He'll ask them, what do you think? And then when you make your response, you better be ready for the blowback. What I mean by blowback, he will challenge you. Well, what do you mean by that? Because I don't think you're right. And I've seen people just fold their cards. And you got to be willing to stand up and say, no, Mr. President, this is why I see it.
Well, we'll see if Vladimir Putin folds his cards, and we'll see what happens. Monday's right around the corner.
Yes, it is.
We'll see what happens on June 2nd. I hope we can talk after that. I really appreciate you coming by the studio, General.
Thanks, Kara. Good to be with you.